Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Joe and Cat Chats.
Yes.
Today is episode 13. We're talking about reparations.
Yes. We are
How are
talking
you
about reparations.
doing?
Yes, I'm excellent. We're going to talk about reparations. Miss Wells, we're going to talk about all of the things that make the United States the way it is now and other countries the way they are, and how it all connects to capitalism, hypercapitalism, imperialism, colonialism, all of the isms that you can think about, racism, colorism, which is going to be a future episode of the Joe and Cat Chat series, all of that. But you asked me a question. You asked me how I'm doing. I'm on fire today. I'm feeling excellent. My new kettlebell arrived today, so I'm going to get stronger, get more fit, and try to reclaim my physique. And yeah, it's been a great day. I had a nice salad.
Good.
Yeah, and the water is nice and cold. It's got plenty of ice in it. Feeling
Beautiful.
good. Yeah, can't ask for much more than that. How are you?
That's amazing. I'm doing well. Yeah, I just have been busy with work and, living life and
Understood.
staying busy as heck. This week has been wild, but I say that every week. So you know what? It's just life.
It's a wild life. It's a wild life. That's it.
So Joe, I want to point out your t-shirt.
Yes.
What a cool t-shirt.
Yes. Yes, I got this from a website called America Hates Us. You can go check them out. I think the website is americahatesus.us. I think this particular t-shirt is sold out. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, on a Friday, I wore a white t-shirt with light blue letters in Hebrew, and the Hebrew letters translated said "Free Palestine." That's another shirt that I got from them also. And I had probably 10 people message me like, "Yo, that's a cool shirt. Where'd you get that?" I'm like, "Go there." But I think that one sold out too. So yeah, they got a bunch of really nice stuff over there. AmericaHatesUs.us, I think it's their website. I think that's what it is. I could be wrong, but just if you want to know more, send me a message. I'll give you the complete information, and we'll get you pointed in the right direction.
Awesome. Yeah, very fitting for today's discussion on reparations. So I appreciate that.
No problem. I'm an appropriate brother, so I figured I would go ahead and dress appropriately for the occasion. And so much of what we're talking about today is reparations. Not just for Black people only, because that's part of it. We're going to talk about reparations not for Black people because I'm a Black person, but we're talking about reparations in the United States for American descendants of enslaved people. And that, I think, it's a bit more nuanced than just, oh, hey, if you're Black, you get reparations.
Yeah.
Not entirely. And we're going to discuss that and lay it all out and make a case, because that's what we do here on the Joe and Cat Chat series. We make the case.
I love it. Yeah, let's get into it. I think that we should start with, our normal stuff, which is we need to define these terms that we're talking about. So
I completely agree.
Yeah. So reparations, what is that? What does it mean?
What does it mean? Reparations. Reparations means to make amends. It's about 2 or 3 episodes ago, I mentioned a quote that my Uncle Ansel told me when I was a young boy. He said, "Joe, if you mess up, fess up. If you mess up, fess up." That essentially is reparations. If you mess up, say you did wrong, and you figure out a way to fix it. Typically, fixing the problem usually comes with some sort of compensation. Usually comes for some type of compensation. The compensation is typically a financial package, and that payment is to someone who has been wronged, or, for the context of this conversation, disenfranchised. So that is what reparations are. There's a couple of different types of reparations. Sometimes you get war reparations. So if one country damages another in war, the country that damages the other in war says, "Yo, look, you damaged my country, I want reparations." And that's happened in several instances. But we're not necessarily going to go in terms of talking about war reparations today. We're going to talk about the type of reparations from human to human, country to country, ethnicity to ethnicity, race to race. We're going to talk about that rather than country to country conflict that resulted in war.
And even like government to people of that same country, which is the most relevant in our conversation, because the war reparations, important, look it up for those who are listening. But yeah, it's not necessarily something that is going to come into the conversation very much today.
True.
Yeah, and I think that an important aspect of what you sort of just mentioned with the word reparations is both recognition and doing something about it. That action piece is what we have emphasized before. And I just want to reiterate that there are governments that will recognize, in quotation marks, sort of the atrocities that they've inflicted upon certain groups, but never actually do anything other than sort of the PR moment, the media moment of acknowledging. So
there's a wonderful book that I continually refer to here, and it is this book, From Here to Equality, and it says on the front, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And what you so eloquently talked about, Ms. Wells, is that whole concept of pursuing reparations. And I'm going to read this verbatim from the book, that way everybody understands what we're talking about. It's sort of a framework called ARC. ARC is an acronym that stands for Acknowledgment, Redress, and Closure. Acknowledgement involves the recognition and admission of the wrong by the perpetrators or beneficiaries of the injustice. For African Americans, this means the receipt of a formal apology and a commitment for redress on the part of the American people as a whole, a national act of declarations that a great wrong has been committed. But beyond an apology, acknowledgement requires those who benefited from the exercise of the atrocities to recognize the advantages they gained and to commit themselves to the cause of redress.
Yes.
Redress can take two forms, not necessarily mutually exclusive: restitution or atonement. Restitution is the restoration of survivors to their condition before the injustice occurred, or to a condition they might have attained had the injustice not taken place. Of course, it is impossible to restore those who were enslaved to a condition preceding their enslavement, not only because those who were enslaved are now deceased, but also because many thousands were born into slavery, which also makes sense. Atonement is an alternative form of redress, occurs when perpetrators or beneficiaries meet the conditions of forgiveness that are acceptable to the victims. Achieving these elements of a reparations program requires good faith negotiations between those who were wronged and the wrongdoers. And closure. Let me read this last part here. Closure involves the mutual reconciliation between African Americans and the beneficiaries of slavery, legal segregation, and ongoing discrimination toward Black people. So ARC, acknowledgement, redress, closure.
Yeah, that's so important. And I love that you just sort of outlined it and read from the book, because it's so important to sort of remember that there are stages to this, and you need all three in order to actually achieve something like reparations. And so I think that is sort of a theme that's probably going to come up a few times, and something to keep in mind for those watching, because a lot of times, we talk about these issues and we learn about them, but there's no action in following with them. No action.
And Catherine, something you said that was interesting a couple of minutes ago. You said that there's steps to this. There's steps to this. And in a bigger picture, reparations, when we talk about steps to this, reparations are a type of justice called transitional justice. Okay, because the process of ARC is a transition. You have to go from one piece to the next. So it's transitional. And transitional justice, it's all the measures implemented in order to redress legacies of human rights violations. Now, though the transitional justice can take a bunch of different forms. We could talk about criminal prosecutions. We could talk about truth commissions. We could talk about actual legislative acts. We could talk about different resolutions. We can talk about scholarship programs, or we could talk about actual reparations programs. Reparations are a form of transitional justice.
Yeah, and actually, when I was looking up some of the terms and things for this episode, I came
Mhm.
across sort of a comparison between transitional justice and restorative justice, because
Okay,
it seems like a lot of times they're sort of used interchangeably.
they are.
And so, yeah, so I just found it really interesting because I'd heard both before, but I didn't really recognize the differences either.
Sure.
So I found that restorative justice acts as a catalyst for transitional justice through the creation of new community bonds and strengthening existing ones.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's also used to sort of reinforce the participatory potential of transitional justice and their mechanisms
Hmm.
by including actors who have traditionally felt alienated from established legal processes and institutions,
Hmm.
which I found interesting because basically it's saying that restorative justice is sort of the more holistic way of including people in an intersectional way, which we've talked about
Perfect.
before,
Absolutely.
and including those who are usually sort of left out of these sort of institutions, legal processes, the systemic things that we talk about dismantling because they are discriminatory. And, so I thought that was kind of a great, I guess, thing to start using, because really we are looking for a more like restorative approach to this, because we want to dismantle white supremacy. We want to use intersectionality to make sure that no one is left behind. And especially when we're talking about things like reparations, it's so important.
It's interesting how, and I just thought of this, when you talked about restorative justice, you said it's a more holistic approach. And everything that you talked about has obvious, to use your term, intersectionality with health.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you think about health, health is supposed to be a holistic process where you look at mind, body, spirit, but you look at all of the social determinants of health that affect a person's well-being. And if you look at how people have been disenfranchised as a result of enslavement and how that has adverse effects on their social determinants of health, it makes sense that you would want to start with a holistic approach, restorative justice, and then move to transitional justice. Because if you want to make sure that people can actually have the benefits of reparations, they have to be at minimum of sound mind, body, and spirit to reap the benefits of reparations. It doesn't do
Mm-hmm.
any good if you get reparations, but you still have, you know, dirty water in the place. You have lead in your water,
Mm-hmm.
or you're suffering from environmental injustices. What good are reparations then when you still have, you know, big agricultural corporations spraying carcinogenics over your overhead? Reparations don't do you any good. So if you can't breathe, or if you can't see, or if you have some sort of illness, all the money in the world's not going to help you.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense to look at restorative justice not only connected to reparations from a social and educational perspective, but also from a health perspective,
Yeah.
because the two go literally, like what I'm doing right now on screen, hand in hand.
Hand in hand, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's the point of this sort of article that I found about this compare that allowed me to sort of compare these two terms,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like you have to restore the mechanisms that are causing the issue in the first place, which is white supremacy in this case. In order for the transitional justice to even work. It's the catalyst for transitional justice. And
Absolutely.
so, yeah, so I thought that was a really interesting sort of article, and I'm glad I found it
Me
and was
too.
able to sort of articulate these two sort of separate but very connected forms of justice, because I think it's important
Yes.
to really address the social impacts of what we need reparations for Black people for.
Yes. And And further on in this discussion, it's not just Black people that deserve reparations. And we're going to talk about that a bit later on, because there have been plenty of people who have been disenfranchised and wronged, and they're not necessarily American descendants of enslaved people. They're not necessarily Black people. There have been plenty of other people who have been disenfranchised. And we're going to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
The United States does not have a lengthy history of even acknowledging reparations for American descendants of slaves or Black people. But payments have been made to certain people in the United States. For example, Alaskans received over $1 billion and 44 million acres of land. The Klamaths of Oregon received $81 million. The South Dakota Sioux received, I think, $105 million. The Chippewas of Wisconsin received, I think, $31 million. The Ottawas of Michigan received about $30 million, maybe a bit more than that. In 1990, 30 years ago, the Japanese Americans, due to internment, received $1.6 billion. And that $1.6 billion worked out to about $20 per person.
Mm-hmm.
Worked out to about not $20 per person, about $20,000 per person.
Oh, I was like, that's...
Yeah, it's about $20,000.
It wasn't going to surprise me if it was only $20 a person, but that's better. 20,000 is,
it's about $20,000 per person. And when there was a particular act that was passed there was a Civil Liberties Act, I think that's what it was called. The name escapes me, but that bill received overwhelming support in the House and overwhelming support in the Senate to make that payment of $1.6 billion to survivors of Japanese American internments 30 years ago.
Yeah, that happened in Canada as well. There was like
Yes.
a public apology in 1988, and they also received, it was 300 million that they provided, and it ended up also being around $20,000 per person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
I mean, does Canada have a lengthy history of paying reparations to people that have been wronged by the Canadian government?
it's complex because they do have a history of paying reparations.
Okay.
The more sort of recent ones have been sort of the Japanese Canadians we just mentioned, and then there was one in 2008 where Ukrainian Canadians were also provided. They were given 10 million for being interned during wartime, which is pretty recent for that.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I found that one surprising too, because I didn't know about it either. But it was like a fairly small sum of money, I guess, in terms of like government spending. So yeah, not necessarily known. But there is a very complex history with Indigenous Canadians.
Sure.
And so I wanted to mention at some point today that there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was established in 2008. It finished its investigation in 2015 and has a whole list of recommendations that have basically been ignored by the governments. And at the time, I mean, it wasn't necessarily surprising because we had a conservative government, so like a right-leaning government in power for about a decade.
Was that during the Harper administration?
Yeah, that was the Harper decade.
Right. Wow.
And then Justin Trudeau was elected, and was very good at telling Indigenous folks that he was going to do something about this Truth and Reconciliation, and really enact the recommendations for the atrocities that the Canadian government has done toward Indigenous folks, and particularly the residential schools was a big topic. So the Canadian Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has recently ordered the government of Canada to change discriminatory practices of child services, which is something that happened after the 60s scoop when RCMP officers, police officers went and basically stole children from Indigenous folks and put them into the foster care system.
Wow.
So yeah, so like the legislature and this tribunal were like, yeah, no, this is not okay. Um, there was discriminatory practices until 2006. So they were like, you can't do this anymore. And just to give people a bit more context, Indigenous children are 50% of the foster care system still to this day in Canada, but represent only 8% of the total Canadian population.
Wow.
So this is a legacy of just just awful treatment of Indigenous folks. But there's no plan for reparations. And the tribunal also ordered the Trudeau government to pay $40,000 per person that were impacted by the welfare system since 2006 when this order happened.
Okay.
Which is about 54,000 children and about a $2 billion payout. But the government has appealed and is not paying. And that's just news from like a couple of weeks ago. They were like, nope, we're appealing. So when I say that Trudeau took over and paid, lip service to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that means nothing because he's actively contributing to further genocide basically of Indigenous folks in Canada. So yeah.
And not to have this turn into a political discussion, but that doesn't necessarily surprise me.
No, me neither.
Because you had Stephen Harper for so long, and he was such this hard right-wing political ideologue. It makes sense that you would get somebody that was a bit to the left of Harper, but still loaded with neoliberalist ideas.
Oh yeah,
he
absolutely.
Came in and he came in with this sort of populist rhetoric, but realistically, he probably governed more like his predecessor rather than what his rhetoric would have you believe he would govern.
Yeah, absolutely. He absolutely came in with sort of this this woke way of speaking, and he calls himself a feminist, and people went nuts over how handsome he apparently is, and that just sort of is appalling now that his policies have proven that he's by far not at all a feminist. He's not at all interested in providing reparations or even acknowledging that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission found what they found, which is, you can look it up online. There's like 96 recommendations and he's done none of them. And in fact, his policies are actively against the advancement or existence of Indigenous people. He bought a pipeline directly against the wishes of the folks who it'll affect directly on the West Coast. So
the Wet'suwet'en. Yes. Let me ask you this question. This is completely unplanned, obviously, because that's kind of how it is with us. Would you say, given everything you just said, that your Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is a segregationist? And if that, is he even racist? Would we even go far as to say that?
I would say yes, that he is racist, because I believe that everybody's racist in one way or another, especially white folks in sort of within this sort of racial hierarchy that we've talked about before.
Sure.
So yeah, absolutely. Also, like, I get it. It was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but like, dude did blackface. Like, ugh. Anyway, that was when the internet existed. So like, come on. What was the word you used about the first part of the question? Is he a segregationist?
Yes.
I haven't thought about that entirely, but it wouldn't surprise me. I think I would say a tentative yes to that one too, because I think anybody who comes from sort of the colonial heritage of Canada will not actually address Indigenous sovereignty or indigenous issues to the extent that they deserve to be addressed. And so it's you know, it seems to be a hard line for leaders, and even when we make any kind of progress, we still, you know, we still uphold these segregation, like the separation of indigenous peoples through you know, the reservation system. Like, you get less benefits if you leave the reservation still, as of today, even if it's not legally like, you're not going to get fined legally for leaving the reservation, but the institutions are still in place, and the cultural and symbolic you know, things, not unlike you know, African American or Black people in the States being over policed.
True.
So, and it's just like these institutions that sort of uphold these things are still in existence. So of course, holding power in sort of the settler colonial way would reaffirm those things and contribute to segregation. That was a long-winded way of saying yes. So
no, Catherine, it actually makes perfect sense, because it sort of segues into what we wanted to talk about, because you mentioned Black people in the United States, and there are certain actions that have taken place with regards to reparations or this type of restorative justice for Black people in the United States. But in nearly every instance, those attempts to commit to ARC, acknowledgement, redress, and closure, and to commit to restorative justice and transitional justice have failed miserably. One of the first true act of restorative justice took place in 1866, which is a year after the Emancipation Proclamation and the passing of the 13th Amendment, which took place in 1865. Now, General Sherman was supposed to execute what's called Order 15. And Order 15 said, hey, you know what? All you freedmen, all you Black folks that used to work in the field, you all are freed men. And look, there's a bunch of land in the southeastern part of the United States. Each household gets the famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule. But it ended up not happening. Because there were still a bunch of really racist white people in the southern parts of the states that were like, no, we're not giving you Black folks this land. So later that year, the Southern Homestead Act came into play. I was like, okay, well, hey, great. We now have all this land. And formerly enslaved people were given 6 months to buy land at reasonable prices without any sort of competition from white people, from the North and from the South. Now think about this. You have been an enslaved person, and you were even born into slavery in many instances, for about 250 plus years. And you were working and you didn't get paid. What sort of capital do you have to buy land?
Precisely.
Hardly
and come
anybody.
up with something in 6 months? Oh my gosh.
There are people now who are struggling to find places to live in 6 months.
Yeah.
And some of us work and get paid decently. Imagine working and not getting paid, and then having to come up with money to try to buy land. It didn't work. So that program failed miserably. Later on, about 100 years later, there was a group of churches and a bunch of other coalitions that came together and created what's called the Black Manifesto. And the Black Manifesto essentially was a call for reparations. It was, hey, look, you know what? We Black people in the United States, American descendants of enslaved people, we have been wronged, and we want money. And the number that they asked for was $500 million back in 1969. They raised a bunch of money. They raised about $200,000 for their effort for the group, but it wasn't nearly what they were expected to get. And that money was raised through different community organizations, different fundraisers, etc. About 25 years later, in the early to mid 90s, actually, I think it was 1994, Florida actually said, hey, you know what? We did some people wrong in an area called Rosewood. And there was a massacre that took place in Rosewood, Florida. So what Florida did is they said, hey, you know what? We're going to set aside a couple of $1 million, and anyone that survived this massacre, you're entitled to some of that money. So that happened. In one of my former states, North Carolina, there was a situation involving eugenics. And then there was an actual payment plan called the North Carolina Eugenics Compensation Plan, where they approved $10 million in reparations for people who were sterilized as a result through eugenics. Turns out there were over 7,000 people that were sterilized as a result of the eugenics situation that took place in North Carolina. And that $10 million went like that.
Oof, yeah. Let me just jump in really quick and just
Absolutely.
mention, I know I was talking about Indigenous folks in Canada before, but I just want to mention also that Aboriginal and Indigenous and all of the folks in Canada have also been part of a forced sterilization program for many years. And it actually, although it on paper says that you're not allowed to participate in it anymore, often they're still unknowingly participating in forced sterilization of women in many places in Canada. So that's an ongoing issue here, and I know that there are some ongoing issues with with Black women in the States as well, in certain areas that are being forced to sterilize themselves or without question, like they just don't know and then they get sterilized.
And thank you for mentioning that, because a perfect example of somewhat forced sterilization happened right here in Baltimore, Maryland. There was because Baltimore, Maryland, 25 to 30 years ago, at one point led the United States in teenage pregnancy. Teenage pregnancy in this city was running rampant. So there was a principal of a middle school that decided to do something about the teenage pregnancy problem, or the catastrophe that it was back then, which was to use a contraceptive that would be implanted inside a woman's arm. And the contraceptive was called Norplan. And I am just now remembering all of this. If you didn't bring up forced sterilization, I would have never remembered any of this. But I remember the controversy that Norplan had, because it was primarily Black girls that were getting this contraceptive in their arm that prevented them from having babies. And there were hardly any white girls that were getting this. It was almost entirely Black women. And there were a lot of people that were upset about this because it appeared to be a form of forced sterilization. Although it was under the veneer or facade of, oh, you know what, we're going to try to reduce the amount of teenage pregnancies in Baltimore. Realistically, it was really more about, you know what, we don't want all these Black girls actually having babies. We want to try to slowly, it was more of a depopulation plan, at least in my recollection, rather than a situation where they were trying to remedy a potential public health situation in terms of having young girls having babies when they weren't emotionally or psychologically or financially ready to do so.
Yeah, and it sort of begs the question that these programs that are established, all of them that we've been talking about, like, where are they getting the information, and is there an intentional or unintentional aspect to these programs where, like, you know, they thought that this program would work, and really it's just perpetuating the social inequalities and you know, racial injustices that already exist, and creating a position where it's like furthering the embeddedness of racism in our communities. And separating us and all the things, and there's a lot to be said.
Absolutely. There's a lot to be said there. You know, and many of these institutions that you talk about, some of these institutions that benefited from racism are colleges and universities. Some of them are schools. Many of the schools on the East Coast, many of these legacy institutions were built by people that look like me and weren't built by people that look like you. That's what happened. Last year, 2019, Georgetown University said, you know what? Yeah, we messed up and we're going to try to fix this. So what they decided to do was say, hey, you know what? We're going to add a $27.20 fee onto every student's tuition. Why $27.20? Because Georgetown University figured out that there were 272 enslaved Africans that helped to build Georgetown University. For those that don't know, Georgetown University is in none other than Washington, D.C., which is the nation's capital. And it's a gorgeous campus, by the way. It's an absolutely gorgeous campus. If you ever get a chance to walk around it, it's so beautiful. It's right on the shores of the Potomac River. And so what they decided to do was say, hey, you know what? We're going to find out where all of the descendants of these enslaved Africans are. We're going to find out where they are. And the majority of them lived in Louisiana, and a bunch of them lived in Maryland, which makes sense because Maryland is right next to Washington, D.C. So what they decided to do is set out a plan to raise at least $400,000 per year with collecting these student fees. And what they decided to do is, rather than issue cash payments, is they decided to set up infrastructure, institutions that support education and that support healthcare in Louisiana and Maryland, where these descendants of these 272 enslaved Africans live. Now, the part of the problem is that this agreement is a non-binding agreement, which is problematic on various levels, because just as we talked about 25 to 30 minutes ago, is with regards to art, with atonement, it has to be a situation where where the party that was aggrieved has to agree to the terms of what is being offered to them. But in this instance, because it's a non-binding agreement, the Georgetown University could be like, yeah, you know what, we don't feel like doing this year. Or, you know what, we've paid these descendants enough. We're just going to go back to, funding our law school and funding the basketball team and our lacrosse team, rather than collecting more money from students to pay the descendants of these 272 enslaved Africans that helped build this magnificent university. Okay, it happened. There's institutions like Georgetown that recognize what their wrongdoings. There are institutions such as the University of Virginia, which is in Charlottesville, Virginia. And one of the major players and founders of that school is none other than former President Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had plenty of slaves. He also had, according to various reports, raped one of his slaves and had children with that slave, Sally Hemings. He also married a woman, and I forget the woman's name, but the woman also had a bunch of slaves. So Thomas Jefferson ended up being one of the wealthiest men in America because of not only being involved with the University of Virginia and having slave labor build that school, but also owning hundreds of slaves and hundreds of acres of land. That's how he was able to acquire all of that wealth. University of Virginia has done nothing to, at least at minimum, acknowledge their legacy of slavery and at least offer some sort of acknowledgement that, yeah, you know what, Black folks built this school and we need to fix it and make it right for our descendants of these Black people. Virginia Theological, keeping it in Virginia Theological Seminary, they said, you know what, yeah, slaves built this school too, and they set aside $1.7 million to pay to their descendants. $1.7 million, not much, but it's a start. The largest sort of financial package that's been set up by a school was through Princeton Theological Seminary. And Princeton Theological Seminary has offered, at least set up, $27 million for various plans to pay reparations for enslaved Africans who helped build Princeton Theological Seminary. So there are some schools that are realizing the errors of their ways and they're going about it in some form or fashion, but there are plenty of schools that really need to look at their history and look at themselves, look at the buildings that are around them, wonder how these buildings got there, look at who built them, and say, hey, you know what? We didn't pay anything to have this building built. This is now probably the reason why we have an endowment of $1.5 billion or $3 billion or $5 billion or $850 million. Why? Because of generations of wealth building, interest accrued on endowments and tuition and fees, merchandising, licensing. Next thing you know, you've got an institution that's worth $1 billion or $2 billion. But what are you doing with that $2 billion?
Right, exactly. I think that's an interesting sort of thing to bring up, that these universities are addressing, or starting to look at addressing in certain particular places, because I find that often universities are sort of these places that are seen as progressive and understanding of the social inequalities, and a lot of social movements are started by students in university, and that's like
Absolutely.
a great progressive thing that happens. You're radicalized because you're learning about the world and doing all the things, and that's certainly what happened to me. I'm so grateful to my experience at university, so much so that I went on to do a master's and do grad school, and I'm sure you're similar. Because you've got 2 master's degrees.
Yep.
But I think it's interesting in the sense that, like, these places are still they're still institutions and still part of sort of the colonial heritage that we built these countries in and around, and they still are just perpetuating these things, despite the fact that they're sort of perceived as progressive. And so I appreciate that there are some places looking at this now and trying to change and trying to do what they think is appropriate as far as reparations, which I personally don't think is enough, but
I agree.
It's a start.
I agree. I mean, you mentioned the fact that I have 2 master's degrees. One of those master's degrees is from none other than Wake Forest University. And Wake Forest University is in a town called Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Mm-hmm. Why does that name Winston sound familiar? Because Winston is a place where they grew a lot of tobacco. It's like Winston cigarettes. Okay.
I wasn't ever a smoker, so I don't know that
Neither
reference.
Neither was I, but I'm sure we might have a smoker or 2 that's watching and or listening. But yeah, Winston cigarettes, and they manufactured tobacco. And Salem, the town next door, was where they did a lot of tobacco growing and manufacturing. Thousands of slaves worked those plantations. And it would not surprise me that when Wake Forest University was built on the current campus that it is now in Winston-Salem, as opposed to where it used to be, which is in a town called Wake Forest, North Carolina, which is about 20 or 30 minutes north of Raleigh. Winston-Salem is about an hour, about an hour and 20 minutes west of there. And it's on a big sprawling campus. The campus looks like a country club. And many of these buildings look old, but they're renovated on the inside. And if you look at a lot of the architecture of many of these older buildings, it resembles architecture of many of these other legacy institutions that were clearly built by enslaved people. If you look at some of the halls or some of the buildings at Georgetown University's campus and the layout of Georgetown University's campus, it looks quite similar to the University of North Carolina, which was also built with slave labor. This concept was talked about in this book here. If you look at University of North Carolina, you could look at Duke University. Duke probably had slave labor that built that school. Wake Forest, similar situation, sprawling campus, big historic looking buildings, probably plenty of Black people who grew up, lived, and died building that school and didn't receive any sort of compensation for it. So I'm saying this now, and I don't know who's actually going to watch it in Winston-Salem or in any of the buildings at Wake Forest, but I would love to have somebody in Wake Forest History Department dig up some archives, look and see if there are any slave registries of people, of enslaved Africans who built that school. And if there was any, which I'm probably assuming there was, find their descendants, do the right thing, find their descendants, pay up, because the school's motto is pro humanitate, which means essentially to help other people or do the right things. It means it's life of service. If you're going to have that as your school motto, but not recognize the legacy of slavery that probably helped build your institution and have a massive endowment that Wake Forest has, then that sort of duplicitousness must end. It has to end. And I would encourage any sort of legacy institution that had a hand with slave labor to build your school, pay up. Johns Hopkins University probably had slaves building that school too. And it's right here in Charles Village in Baltimore. They probably had a load of Black people building that school, just like Princeton did, Harvard, Yale, and a lot of your Ivy League schools, just like the University of South Carolina. Clemson probably had loads of slaves building their schools. University of Alabama. University of Alabama didn't hire their first Black professor until 1966.
Yeah.
So it's time for a lot of these colleges and universities to look at themselves and say, you know what? We got to do something about this. And it's got to be more than just, okay, let's find their descendants and start issuing checks. It's got to be something like what Georgetown University did and say, hey, you know what? Yeah, we're going to also create institutions that deal with literacy and health and education, but we're also going to start writing checks also. Oh, and if you have anybody that wants to go to school here, we'll foot the bill for that.
Yes.
And if they want to live on campus, yeah, we'll foot the bill for that too. We'll pay for your meal plan also, and not just the 15 meal a week plan. We'll give you the big meal plan, the 30 meal plan. We'll pay you, because it's only right that these institutions that benefited from slavery make the proper amount of restitution.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think that, I just think that these places are touted as progressive. And so like, it's time, like, prove it. This is a conversation that we have been having for a long time. And I think it's time that these institutions look at themselves and really, start to take action and provide reparations in all forms. Like you just mentioned, like 5 different ways that reparations can be paid. And all of those are valid, and all of them should be incorporated in this conversation in all of these places. So, yeah.
And it's all doable. And in these sorts of legacy institutions that somehow separate themselves in a class perspective, in a classist sort of way. That's why your top schools are considered Ivy League schools, and they're supposedly higher. They're supposed to be these bastions of higher learning, or institutions of higher learning. Well, I'm going to challenge that, because what good is having all of your PhDs in history and anthropology, yet you fail to acknowledge your history of slavery and enslavement of people that helped build your institution to what it is now?
Exactly.
What good are all those PhDs doing? They're not doing anything if you don't look at your own history, recognize your history, atone for your mistakes, and have some restitution and some sort of closure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a really important point of something I read actually in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations is, and it's part of the ARC, which is acknowledgement. You need to be putting the true history into the curriculum for people to be learning about and understanding the impact, and acknowledge your role in history.
Absolutely.
And also do all the other things you just mentioned.
Absolutely. And I know we have about 8, maybe 9 minutes left, and there's still quite a bit of information we want to get to. But last week we talked about international issues. There have been countries now, since we're talking about colleges and universities trying to do the right thing, and we talked about payments that have been made from the United States to certain people. There are countries that have made reparations payments to other people. For example, Austria has made reparations payments to Holocaust survivors. You mentioned Canada eloquently about 20 to 30 minutes ago, where they talked about two Native Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, and Japanese Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
Germany has made loads of payments to Holocaust survivors. France has also made payments to Holocaust survivors and their families through their French railroad system, because the French railroad system was complicit in basically transporting Jews from one place to another. So the French said, okay, hey, you know what? We're going to find all of the people who were involved, who we moved around, and then we're going to find their families, and we're going to start paying them through the French railroad system, which brings up another interesting point about companies, because reparations is not solely just, okay, people who have been disenfranchised going after a particular government. There are some institutions, corporations, businesses that have benefited for generations, centuries as a result of enslavement. Yeah. Citibank is one of them. Take a look at the Haitian Revolution and Citibank and how France was able to finance their warships. The bank that eventually financed all of them is Citibank. Some of these legacy insurance companies that underwrote boats and underwrote slaves for slave bonds. Mm-hmm. Slave bonds. The concept of slave bonds was in another wonderful book, Black Banking and the Racial Wealth Gap. They talked about slave bonds and some of the insurance companies that insured the bonds for slavery. So Black people, human beings, could be used as collateral.
Yeah, absolutely.
To buy supplies and buy livestock. That happened.
Yeah. And the insurance thing is something that everyone should look into. We don't have time to get into it today, but absolutely look into that, because it is so counterintuitive on how its policies are made and maintained. And it just is such an awful thing to look into, that I just encourage everyone to look into it, because it's really, really important.
I agree. And I mean, some of the other reparations demands that are being made right now. A couple of months back, June 30th, was Belgium's Independence Day. Mm-hmm. Belgium colonized loads of countries in Africa. And the Congolese Belgians were like, you know what? We're not celebrating this national holiday today. And we want reparations. If you know anything about King Leopold and what he did to generations of Congolese people, cutting off their hands if they didn't produce enough rubber. That happened. Yeah. That happened. So there's loads of Congolese that are asking for reparations. Burundi is another country in Africa that was colonized formerly by Germany and then eventually colonized by Belgium. The people of Burundi want 43 billion with a B dollars combined from both of those countries. Mm-hmm. Portugal. I don't think we need to talk a whole lot about Portugal, because Portugal pioneered the slave trade. When I was in Fort Monroe last week, it was a Portuguese ship that came from Angola that was eventually captured by two British ships that eventually made its way to the area now known as United States. That happened. There's also another organization in the Caribbean called CARICOM, which is a Caribbean community. It stands for Caribbean Community. And it's 15 nations. And they are now putting together a 10-point plan for reparations. Something I like to mention about all this is CARICOM was founded in Trinidad. That's where my parents are from, and I love Trinidad. I wish I was there right now. But it's now headquartered in Guyana. And it's a 10-point plan. The 10 points of the plan are a formal apology, repatriation, an indigenous peoples development program, cultural institutions, I mentioned this earlier, public health, illiteracy eradication, African knowledge program, which is so important, psychological rehabilitation, technology transfer, and debt cancellation. It is a 10-point plan that CARICOM has put up. You can look at that 10-point plan on CARICOMreparations.org. It began in 2013. And what the CARICOM people want to do is not necessarily look at United States for reparations. No, they're looking at the European governments that primarily colonized the Caribbean. And most of the colonizing countries were the United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands, and maybe a little bit of Spain, which might explain why there are so many different languages. Why those languages, Dutch, French, Spanish, and English, essentially dominate the Caribbean. There's a little bit of Dutch with Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, and Saint Martin. You had some Spanish with Cuba and Dominican Republic, and you have some French with Haiti and some other islands. But the majority of those islands are English-speaking former colonies of England. The country of my parents from, Trinidad, colony of England until 1962. Jamaica, colony until 1964. So a lot of these countries in Europe that are doing well economically, that have high gross domestic products, they're going to have to start looking at paying a lot of these Caribbean brothers and sisters a lot of big checks, and start to look at citizenship, start to look at repatriation, and start to look at a lot of the things that are in that 10-point plan, because there's a whole lot of people that are in England and France and in Netherlands and Spain that benefited on the backs of Caribbean people.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish we had more time to talk about CARICOM, because those 10 points are so important, and I'm super glad that they're outlined. Please look them up, everyone. We're running out of time. We only have less than 2 minutes left, but I also just wanted to mention really quickly that I focused a lot on Indigenous folks in Canada and the sort of the government Indigenous relationships today. But I also just want to make sure that I note that reparations for Black people are also something that needs to happen in Canada, because we did have slavery.
I agree with that.
A lot of people just tout Canada as sort of the place where the Underground Railroad was, but we had slavery for recorded slavery for 200 years before that even happened. And the Underground Railroad also wasn't all it was chalked up to be. Yeah, there's a lot of history there. So I encourage everyone to look up that stuff.
Exactly.
We've mentioned it before. Africaville is also one
I was just going
to
to say
look
Africaville.
up.
Yep.
Yeah, Nova Scotia has a very tumultuous history with Black people. So yeah, but otherwise we have to wrap it up.
Yeah, we have about a minute, maybe 30 seconds or so left. Black people in the United States, American descendants of slaves. There are various figures in terms of money that we are owed. There's various dollar amounts, etc. Some dollar amounts are in the single trillion, some are in the 30 to 40 billion dollar range, depending on certain estimates. Some are approaching 18 to 20 trillion dollars. There's one estimate by economist Larry Neal that says by 2019, Black people, American descendants of slaves, should be owed 114 trillion with a T dollars. So there's plenty of legislation that's in the books right now. HR 40 is out there, House Resolution 40. Take a look at that. There's loads of different books that we can take a look at with regards to figuring out how much the cost of reparations should be. But I know we have to go because we've officially run out of time.
We have, and I'm so sorry because we had so much more to talk about. But thank you so much, Joe, for continuing to do this with me every week. And we're going to just keep on rocking. Next week, we're going to talk about colorism. So please stay tuned. And thank you again, Joe.
You're very welcome. You're the best. Take care.
You're the best, too.
All right.
Take care.
Love you.